A new priest discovers a hidden soundproofed room beneath his church and unknowingly opens the door to a long-buried secret. As investigator Bennett Crowe digs into the past, faith, guilt, and silence unravel into a mystery the town tried to forget. A haunting, slow-burn detective story where the truth waits beneath the floorboards.
The Room Below. Chapter 1. The Seam in the Wall.
The whole began as an honest mistake. Father Aaron Whitcomb had signed the work order for a boiler replacement, the kind of dull expense parishes hate to fund. The contractor lifted old plywood, traced a line of sweating pipe, and then tapped, once, then again, against a stretch of painted masonry behind the rectory stairs. The sound came back wrong, not stone, but a tight, padded thud. The foreman said, probably dead space from an earlier retrofit. He pried the baseboard, slid a crowbar behind a hairline crack, and opened a seam wide enough to breathe through. A trickle of dust fell like flour. The foreman leaned in with a flashlight. Huh. Whitcomb took the light and looked for himself. The beam found a narrow chamber, just wider than a coffin and twice as long, lined with a quilt of old insulation and something black and rubbery behind it. The surfaces were strangely clean, no cobwebs, no drift of mouse droppings. Along one wall, at ankle height, were scuffs in the paint, faint crescents where something had rubbed in small arcs. "Seal it back up?" the foreman asked, already calculating hours. Whitcomb kept the light steady. His stomach made a slow, disloyal turn. He was new to Briars Creek and its parish politics, new enough to hear people call Father Ardain a saint without flinching. Ardain had served 40 years and died in his sleep a month ago, with a line around the block at his funeral. "Let me make a call," Whitcomb said. He stepped out to the alley and dialed a number that wasn't in any diocesan directory. Detective Paul McKenna picked up on the second ring, sounding exactly as he had in seminary softball before Whitcomb left the program and McKenna stayed with the badge. "Aaron, you only call when you're trying to stay out of trouble. I need your eyes." Quietly. McKenna arrived in plain clothes and walked the basement with his hands in his pockets, the way men do when they want you to think they're not touching anything. He didn't step inside the narrow room. He didn't have to. He bent, inspected the seams, and then crouched by the floor where a short run of pipe disappeared under a small resin-capped drain. He looked up. Who knew about this? No one. Until 40 minutes ago. You told the Chancery. Whitcomb hesitated. I told you. McKenna's mouth made a shape somewhere between a sigh and a thin smile. Good. Don't touch another thing. He stood, stepped back, and pulled out his phone. Not 911. Not yet. A quiet internal call to log the discovery. We'll do this right, he said, for everyone's sake. The foreman drifted closer, sensing the shift. We done here today, Father? Whitcomb nodded. Yes, thank you. They covered the opening with heavy plastic and blue tape. Whitcomb watched the rectangle of darkness until the tape was the only thing left to look at. He wanted to pray, and couldn't find a word that didn't feel theatrical. Upstairs, afternoon light found the nave in patient strips. A woman arranged lilies with the careful economy of someone who'd arranged too many. When Whitcomb passed, she asked if the new boiler would be noisy. Not during services, he said, and heard his own voice from far away. In his office, he opened the bottom drawer of the desk he'd inherited and found the parish keys, thick, unlabeled, more metal than anyone needs. One of them was notched on both sides, the kind cut for older interior latches. He set it on a blotter and stared until his eyes watered. His email chimed. A message from the Diocesan Victor General, subject line, Renovation Oversight. The body was polite, all fraternal care and administrative gravity. In the event of any unusual discoveries, please notify the Chancery before contacting local authorities so we can ensure proper handling. He read it twice, then closed the laptop. McKenna came back with a younger officer carrying evidence kits. They worked without conversation, photographing, swabbing, bagging what there was to bag. A fabric scrap caught by a nail behind a foam panel, the resin plug over the drain, a flake of the black, heavy membrane behind the insulation. They measured the chamber, then measured the corridor that led to it, then measured the door between the sacristy and the stairs. The kind of math that makes a space say what it was built for. Whitcomb stood aside, hands in his sleeves, and tried not to think in pictures. He failed. He saw a boy sitting against the wall, knees up, hands between. He shook the image away, angry at himself for the thought, angrier for not having had it sooner. When they were done, McKenna peeled off his gloves and wrote a time in a small notebook. "We're going to step out the front. If anyone asks, we were checking the boiler permit." "Paul," Whitcomb said, and stopped. "What did you ask in a town that once treated another priest as a minor saint? What do I do if this is real?" sounded cowardly even in his head. He tried again. "How loud is this going to get?" "Depends what the lab says," McKenna said, paused, "and what people remember when they're given permission." "Permission?" "Not to like a dead man," McKenna said, almost gently. "You'll be surprised what that unlocks."
After they left, Whitcomb walked the nave again, pausing by the confessional, by the font, by the pew where a plaque named the Ardain family. Each object sat in its posture of use, innocent as furniture. He made himself go back downstairs. He stood in the cool air until the plastic's blue rectangle felt like the only color in the world. He reached for the light and stopped. He didn't want darkness to have the last word. He left the stair light on and locked the rectory door behind him. On the sidewalk, 2 teenagers passed, laughing at something Whitcomb didn't hear. Across the street, a man in a canvas apron swept his shop stoop, looked up at the sight of a detective's unmarked sedan, and looked away fast, the way people do when they've seen just enough to start a story. Bennett Crowe didn't get the call until evening. He was 3 hours south in a room that felt like a filing cabinet emptied onto a desk, a Miles album at low volume threading through old case notes. McKenna's voicemail was unadorned. "We found a built room under a rectory in Briars Creek. Looks like someone cared about sound. I need your eyes on it before the wrong committee declares it a broom closet." Crowe listened with his coffee going cold. He had learned to dread rooms designed to keep sound from leaving. He had also learned not to assume what a room meant until it confessed. He checked the clock, then his limp with a glance, the way a man checks the weather in his own bones. He turned off the jazz and the desk light and left the office as it was, honest, cluttered, not pretending to be anything more. On the hall, he paused at a corkboard where people in old photographs smiled in black and white as if history were a joke they enjoyed. He didn't pin new photos anymore. He carried cases elsewhere, in a phone full of notes, in the exactness of his steps, in the way he watched a hinge give up its secrets. On his way out, he picked up a small case of tools that looked disappointingly like a plumber's. He drove north in the dark, past mile markers that did not care who he was, past towns that solved their own problems until they couldn't. Somewhere near midnight, he stopped for gas and a terminal coffee, stood in the fluorescent wash, and thought of the word McKenna hadn't used on the voicemail. Victim. Crowe liked that about McKenna. He liked the way some men let a case name itself.
He reached Briar Creek at midnight. The church sat on a slight rise like a ship taking on light. He parked on the side street and watched the place for a minute, because that's what he always did. Let a building lay out its habits. The lights in the rectory stairwell were still on. Good. Someone there understood that light is not a cure, but it is a posture. Crowe got out, felt the gravel under his shoes and the old familiar catch in his hip that came with weather and long drives and years of ignoring doctor's advice. He crossed the lot, unlocked by a detective's texted code, and stepped into the cool, clean hall to find the new priest waiting, tired and too young for the amount of worry in his face. "Mr. Crowe," Whitcomb said, offering a hand. "Thank you for coming." "Father," Crowe said. He looked past him to the taped rectangle on the wall and the neat ladder of the stairs. "Let's see the room." Whitcomb led the way. The basement smelled like what churches always smell like: paper, old wood, the ghost of incense, a hint of dust that has made its peace with sanctity. At the tape, Crowe paused, took in the edges, the tool marks, the absence of ambient noise inside the space. He put on gloves without ceremony, cut 3 strips of tape, and knelt. He didn't step in. He let the beam of his flashlight move no faster than a hand tracing a scar. Foam over membrane, membrane screwed into studs. The screws new compared to the wood. In the corner, a sliver of fabric caught on a nail, the way a sleeve remembers a hand. He clicked the beam off and stood very still until he heard his own breath. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, which is not the same as kind. "Whitcomb, did Ardain like projects?" "Projects?" "Renovations, weekend fixes, things people don't argue with a priest about." Whitcomb swallowed. "He did most things himself." "Of course he did," Crowe said. He straightened. "We'll need lab time and patience." Detective McKenna said as much. "Good," Crowe said. He looked once more at the taped mouth of the room and then at the drain. "And we'll need to be ready for what happens if the town starts to remember." Whitcomb nodded, eyes on the tape. "People will talk. They always do. It's what they say first that matters." He set down his kit and began to work. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2. Small Town Noise.
By morning, the plastic over the basement seam had become part of the building. Another rectangle, another notice, another thing not to touch. The contractor's crew pretended not to see it. Father Whitcomb poured coffee he didn't drink and answered emails that didn't require answers, waiting for something to happen that wasn't his to start. On Main Street, a patrol car eased to the curb outside Harrigan's Hardware because the younger officer liked the licorice ropes they kept in the jar by the register. He went in, bought 2, and left. That should have been the end of it, but the owner watched the car idle, then watched it go, and later told the barber that it was funny seeing a cruiser near the church on a Thursday. "Paperwork," the barber said. "They do that sometimes." "Paperwork," the owner agreed, the way you agree with a word that asks to be repeated. He mentioned that Father Ardain used to fix half the town's faucets for free. He mentioned he'd once seen the old man scold a kid for running in the aisle like he'd knocked over a relic. He mentioned the way Ardain remembered everyone's names and where their mothers worked. The barber nodded without comment and trimmed a line so straight it could have been drawn with a ruler. At the diner, a woman who had sung alto in the choir for 30 years said she missed Ardain's homilies. He had a way of making you feel seen, even when you had nothing to confess. "Didn't care for chatter, especially from the boys," the waitress said, setting down coffee. "She believed in discipline," the woman said, as if that closed a door. By afternoon, the thread had wound its way to the thrift store, where a former altar boy named Gideon, 40 now, thicker in the middle, eyes tired, was sorting donations. He heard the hardware story third hand. He heard the words basement repairs. He heard the barber's line about paperwork and the choir woman's fondness. None of it was remarkable. All of it added up to an old feeling he had trained himself not to feel. He took a box to the back room and sat on a stool among other people's clothes. He remembered a night when he was 9 and had said the wrong thing about angels, and Father Ardain had put a hand on his shoulder, guiding, smiling, explaining the virtue of quiet. Sit here. Think about obedience. He remembered a door closing on sound. He remembered the humidity of his breath inside the dark.
He told himself, as he always had, that nothing happened. He told himself, as he didn't always have to, that even if something had, there was no one left to tell. He waited until the feeling passed. This time it did not. Across town, Caleb Hart listened to the same stories and felt more than a feeling. It came on like an old bruise you hadn't realized was still tender. At lunch, he left his sandwich untouched and instead drove by the church as if the building might look different now, as if the bricks would reveal an opinion. He saw the stairwell light through frosted glass and the new priest's car in the side lot, and the memory he'd named Punishment for 20 years grew a second name he didn't want to use. He parked 2 blocks away and composed a text to a number listed on the town website for non-emergency police inquiries. He deleted it. He called the main line and hung up as soon as a dispatcher said hello. At 3, he called again and made it to the end of a sentence. I heard there were repairs in the rectory. I used to be an altar boy under Father Ardain, and there was a room down there. He put me in it once, to think, I think. Is that something you need to know?
The dispatcher asked his name. He gave it. She asked if he wanted to speak to a detective. He hesitated, because names make things exist. He said yes, because sometimes that is how you make yourself bigger than a memory. Detective McKenna met him in a small interview room at the station, the kind painted the color of aspirin. Caleb looked at the table, then the door. McKenna did the thing he did best. He didn't hurry the silence. He let Caleb choose his words and his pace and his exits. It was just the once, he said, and then corrected himself. That I remember as once. He called it reflection. I thought it was punishment. I thought I'd done something wrong. It was dark. He said, "Don't make a sound." Do you remember where the door was? Off the stairs. Past the furnace, then a turn. The door didn't look like a door. What did it sound like? Nothing, Caleb said, surprised by the answer, and less surprised by the way it made his chest feel hollow. You could hear the boiler sometimes. It felt like a hum. But when people walked upstairs, I don't know. It was like being underwater, like sound hit the wall and ran out of it. McKenna nodded once. Thank you. That's it? For now. Caleb's shoulders moved with a breath that didn't quite get all the way out. I'm not saying anything happened. I know, McKenna said. You told me something did. When Caleb left, he walked the long way to his car and stared at the church until staring made him angry at himself. He drove home without the radio on. At St. Bartholomew's, Crowe collected the first lab run. Nothing conclusive yet,
just notes about degraded biological material on the fabric sliver and the hint of blood proteins in the drain sediment. Early. Too early for declarations. He logged the results without flourish and asked Whitcomb for access to any old parish files that weren't sacramental under lock. "What are you looking for?" Whitcomb asked. "Things men write down when they're sure no one will check. Receipts, ledgers, repair orders, notes in the margins." Whitcomb opened a metal cabinet with a gentle violence that looked like he was apologizing to it. He carried out 3 cardboard boxes labeled by decade. The 1980s box smelled like damp and carbon paper. He opened it and found, midway down, a small clutch of receipts from a supplier who no longer existed. On one, the item line read, MLV, 2 pound per square foot. He didn't smile. He wrote the code in his notebook and underlined it twice. "How long will this take?" Whitcomb asked, knowing the answer and hating it. "As long as the town needs to say the quiet parts aloud," Crowe said. He closed the box and set another beside it. Outside, the thin weather of late spring staggered between warm and not. At the diner, the waitress told the choir woman that the new priest seemed decent. The choir woman agreed. Ardain was different, she said, as if describing a weather pattern. He had ways. What ways? The woman stirred sugar into tea she didn't sweeten. He had rules, she said, for the boys. She didn't say anything about basements or doors or silence. She didn't need to. Not yet. The words were out in town like seeds, and the ground was starting to remember what to do with seeds. Near dusk, McKenna texted from the station. Former Ultra Boys filed a statement. Says he was locked in a room to reflect. You were right about permission. Crowe read the message and filed it next to the receipt code in his head, where paper and memory start to agree. He set the 1990s box on the desk and found the funeral ledger inside it by weight, the way you find a Bible on a shelf with your hand. The entries were neat, precise, Father Ardain's small, careful script. Certain weeks were crowded with ink, funerals done quick, sometimes 2 in the morning, closed caskets, notes about family's wishes, a matching receipt for a deeper coffin model. It was enough to raise a thought, not an accusation. Crowe took a photo of the pages and closed the book. He looked at Whitcomb, who looked thinner than he had at noon. "I'm going to need names of anyone who carried a casket in the 1990s and remembers anything odd." Whitcomb nodded. "There's a groundskeeper, retired now, lives near the lake, talks about the past the way people talk about weather." "Good," Crowe said. He put on his coat. "People who remember weather remember weight." Whitcomb blinked, understanding a second too late. "Weight?" "Coffins," Crowe said, and let it be the ordinary word as he could make it. He left the church with the last light and walked past the taped rectangle without looking, the way you pass a mirror when you're not ready to see yourself. On the sidewalk, a couple said goodnight in that small-town way that means they'll see each other in the morning without making a plan. The bell in the tower marked the hour without insisting on it. Back in his car, Crowe set the funeral ledger photos beside the receipt codes, beside the lab's early notes, beside a boy's memory of a room where sound stopped. The case felt, in that moment, like something that had chosen its pace long before he arrived. He turned the key and let the engine idle, then reached for his phone and typed a new note with 2 words and a question mark. Heavy casket? End of Chapter 2.
Chapter 3. The Mother.
The house looked tired before she even opened the door, the kind of small, single-story place that carried too many seasons in its paint. Crowe parked beneath a maple that hadn't decided whether to keep its leaves and watched Lydia Marsh wipe her hands on a dish towel before stepping onto the porch. He showed her his identification quietly. No badge flash, no weight behind it, just the plain truth of his name. "Police again?" she asked, voice rough from cigarettes or tears or both. He said, "Consultant. I'm helping them make sense of some old records." She nodded without asking which ones. That told him she already knew. Inside, the living room was small but orderly. Coffee tables stacked with folded laundry, a jar of coins, and a photograph turned slightly away from the window light. A boy, maybe 10, missing a front tooth, wearing a church sweater 2 sizes too big. Daniel. "I haven't seen that picture in years," she said, when she caught him looking. "Found it in a box last week. I was going to put it away again, but didn't." Crowe took the chair she offered. "You gave him to Father Ardane's care?" She laughed once, a dry, disbelieving sound. "You make it sound like an adoption ad. I was in bad shape, pills back then. Everyone told me the priest was helping, said he ran some kind of outreach for kids whose parents needed space." She rubbed her wrist, still wearing the faint bracelet marks from long-ago hospital bands. "He said Daniel would stay at the rectory for a bit, attend school, I could get clean and visit later." "You signed papers?" "Something from the parish. I remember the line where it said, 'temporary guardianship.' I remember because I didn't like that word, guardianship. It felt like I was handing over more than a few months." "When did you come back?" 2 years later. I finished rehab, wrote the priest, called the church. He told me Daniel had been placed with a good family upstate. Said the boy didn't want to see me. He'd moved on." Her voice faltered there, caught between bitterness and shame. "I believed him. I wanted to believe him. I figured Daniel deserved better." "Did he ever give you a name of the family?"
Just said they were private people. She blinked hard. I asked once more, maybe a year after that. He told me not to make trouble. Said my son had found salvation. Crowe waited. People always filled silence eventually. She added, as if confessing something smaller than it was. "She sent me a letter once. Said Daniel was doing well. Typed, not signed. I thought maybe it was from him. Now," she pressed a hand to her temple, "I can't even remember if the envelope was postmarked." Crowe asked for permission to take the papers. She hesitated, then handed over a manila envelope from a drawer, brittle with years. Inside were photocopied forms, parish stationery, stamped with Ardane's name. The guardian signature on line 2 was blurred, but familiar enough to Crowe, same looping hand that filled the funeral ledgers. The supposed social worker's line read, "Sister Margaret Vale." Vale. The parish secretary from that era, still living, he remembered from Whitcomb's notes. He closed the envelope gently. "Do you want me to tell you if we find him?" Her mouth moved toward a smile that didn't arrive. "You won't, but yes." Outside, wind caught a chime on the porch. He paused at his car, wrote 2 things in his notebook. Forgery likely, same hand. Mother's guilt keeps silence longer than threats. He drove straight back to St. Bartholomew's, where Whitcomb was waiting in the nave, hands folded as if unsure whether to pray or apologize. "I heard from Detective McKenna. They think there may be DNA evidence from the drain sample. Preliminary only. Male, juvenile. Could mean anything, could mean nothing." Whitcomb nodded, but didn't believe it. "You spoke with the mother?" She thought her son was adopted, signed him over while she was in rehab. Whitcomb's face tightened, shame finding its way under his collar. Ardane counseled half this town through guilt. He knew how to pick people who'd never question him. Predators study their audience. I pulled the photocopy from the envelope and laid it on the pew between us. "See the signature?" Whitcomb leaned closer. "It's his. And here, the social worker. That's your current parish secretary's name." "Margaret Vale," Whitcomb whispered. "She worked here until her husband died. still lives off Lake Road. Crow gathered the paper, slid it into a sleeve. We'll pay her a visit. Margaret Vale's house sat above the lake, pale curtains drawn against the glare. She answered the door in a cardigan that seemed to remember better years. "Father Whitcomb," she said softly, surprised but not displeased. "And Bennett Crowe. We're reviewing old parish documentation. I wanted to confirm a few signatures." Her eyes flickered, not alarmed but careful. "Father Ardain handled most of that himself." Crowe handed her the copy. "This name, yours?" She frowned at the page. "My name, yes. My writing? No. I never signed those. He often used my title for community programs. Said it made things look official. I assumed he meant paperwork for collections." "He didn't tell you what they were for?" Her fingers trembled. "He didn't tell anyone anything. You didn't say no to Father Ardain. He made it sound like he was doing God's work, and who was I to ask which part of it? Do you remember a boy named Daniel Marsh?" She darted to the window. "He was small, quiet, stayed in the rectory for a few weeks, then gone." "You asked where?" I did," she said quickly, as though it mattered that she had. "He said the mother had taken him back. I didn't press." Crowe glanced at Whitcomb. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy with the years she'd spent convincing herself she'd done nothing wrong. "Mrs. Vale," Crowe said gently, "do you remember any funerals that seemed unusual? Heavy caskets, rushed services?" She hesitated, color draining from her face. "Once," she said finally, "old Mrs. Conway, maybe 90, no family left. He insisted we bury her the next morning, said he'd handled arrangements personally. I remember the pallbearers struggling. We thought the wood was thick. He joked about her carrying the weight of sin." Whitcomb's throat tightened. "You never questioned it?" "It wasn't our place," she whispered. Crowe folded the page back into his folder. "It is now."
Back at the rectory, Whitcomb sat at his desk, staring at the keys again. The silence of the church had changed character. It felt aware now. Crowe worked methodically, cross-referencing Ardain's service log with cemetery permits. There it was. Conway, 1995. Closed casket. Priest only. And beneath it, a faint pencil note in the margin. Additional blessing performed. Private.
He stared at it for a long moment before saying, "We'll need a warrant for that grave." Whitcomb looked up sharply. "Do you think he—" "I think it's the first place he wouldn't be suspected of hiding anyone, and the last place anyone would look." The priest swallowed. "I'll cooperate. You already are," Crowe said quietly. He called McKenna, outlined what they had, the forged guardianship, the secretary's statement, the funeral anomaly. The detective was silent for a long second. "I'll push it through the DA. We'll keep it narrow. One grave, enough to confirm or deny." Crowe hung up, leaned back in the chair and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He thought about Lydia Marsh's trembling voice, about the secretary's half-believed lies, about the boy who never grew old enough to argue with either of them. When he finally spoke, it was mostly to himself. If he used one funeral, he used more. Whitcomb heard it and didn't ask what it meant. Outside, the evening bell began to toll. Each note rolled out across the town, steady and even, the same rhythm that had marked weddings, deaths, and every Sunday in between. Downstairs, behind the taped plastic, the air in the sealed room stayed perfectly still. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. The Heavy Casket. The morning of the exhumation order, Briar Creek looked the same as it always had. Dew on the grass, the diner's smell of burnt coffee drifting across Main Street, and no sign that anything was about to change. The warrant was narrowly worded. 1 grave, specific coordinates, limited observers. The district attorney had agreed only after McKenna pressed that the paperwork matched forged guardianship forms. Crowe didn't gloat. He'd learned long ago that winning the right to dig meant you were already too close to the kind of truth that didn't let you sleep. The cemetery lay just behind the church, its headstones leaning like tired men in rows. The plot marked Conway, Agnes, 1905 to 1995, sat under a sugar maple whose roots had broken the earth in slow rebellion. The forensics van arrived at 8 sharp, the hum of its generator cutting through the morning quiet. McKenna stood off to one side, clipboard in hand. Whitcomb came too, against the advice of the diocese. "I should be here," he'd said. "Someone from the church should be." Crowe didn't argue. They began carefully. A crew removed the topsoil, boxed it, and logged depth. The air smelled of clay and old rain. When the lid of the casket appeared, dark wood, brass fittings still dull but intact, everyone stopped talking. The lead tech brushed away dirt with a gloved hand. "Seal looks good," he murmured. "No moisture breach." Crowe crouched, studying the edges. The coffin was indeed deeper than standard, maybe 3 extra inches, enough for something small, hidden below or between layers. McKenna gave the nod. The coroner's team unbolted the lid. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of hinges surrendering to air for the first time in 30 years. Inside lay what they expected: the shrouded remains of an elderly woman, perfectly still, the lace of her burial dress intact where the fabric had mummified. Beneath the folds of cloth at her feet, a bundle, faintly discernible, distorted the lining. "Stop," Crowe said softly. The coroner adjusted his light, peeled back the lower portion of the shroud. Beneath the fabric lay another shape, smaller, curled, wrapped in the remnants of white altar linen. The pattern of the embroidery, tiny gold crosses, was unmistakable. Someone whispered an oath. Whitcomb took a step back, the blood gone from his face. The coroner's voice was clinical, but strained. "Juvenile remains, partial skeletonization, likely prepubescent male." Crowe stood very still. "Leave the linens intact. Bag the entire wrap." He watched as they lifted the small form out, the weight of it shockingly light. A tarnished metal slipped loose from the folds and clinked against the coffin edge. Crowe stooped, picked it up with tweezers. St. Jude, the patron of lost causes. Whitcomb turned away, hand against his mouth. Dear God. McKenna's face had hardened into the mask police wear when they need to stay professionals, not people. "We'll run DNA," he said quietly. Crowe nodded, eyes still on the coffin. "We already know what it'll say."
By noon, the scene was sealed, samples logged, and the second coffin readied for transport. Reporters had begun circling the outer fence, their telephoto lenses glinting like insects in sunlight. The diocesan lawyers arrived in suits that didn't belong outdoors. They spoke in low, urgent tones about respect for the deceased and avoiding desecration. McKenna ignored them. Whitcomb did not. He met their gaze evenly. Respect would have been burying one soul at a time. Crowe said nothing. He was too busy taking photographs, close-ups of the coffin lining, the linen weave, the brass screws used to reseal after burial. Everything told a story of preparation, not panic. The boy hadn't been dumped, he'd been placed. That afternoon,
Crowe sat in McKenna's office while the forensic lab processed preliminary DNA. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the silences. "You ever get used to this?" McKenna asked, eyes on the monitor. "No," Crowe said. "You just learn where to stand." The results came back before dusk. Mitochondrial DNA, positive match to Lydia Marsh's maternal line. McKenna exhaled. Daniel Marsh. Crowe closed his notebook slowly. It fits. Everything fits. He glanced at the photo pinned to the evidence board, the smiling boy in the oversized sweater. He thought of Lydia's hands trembling over her coffee cup and the letter she'd kept all those years. He didn't just hide them, Crowe said. He gave them funerals. McKenna frowned. "You mean he used other services as cover?" Crowe nodded. "All those quick burials, closed caskets, done without family. If we cross-reference coffin dimensions and funeral invoices, we'll find more. 2, maybe 3. "Jesus," McKenna whispered. "Don't invoke him here," Crowe said, not unkindly. By evening, Crowe drove back to the rectory. Whitcomb waited in the nave, the light from the stained glass pooling red across the floor. He looked older by years. "It's confirmed?" he asked. "It's him." Whitcomb's voice barely carried. "I read the old sermons from those years. He talked about mercy more than anything. Mercy and silence." Crowe nodded. "He made people complicit with faith. That's how predators build kingdoms." "What happens now?" "Officially, the DA will prepare a statement. They'll order more reviews, maybe more exhumations." "And unofficially?" Crowe looked toward the altar. "People will remember. That's how it starts, memory, not miracles." Whitcomb lowered himself onto the front pew. "I keep wondering if he confessed before he died." "If he did," Crowe said, "he picked the kind of God who doesn't answer back."
The next day, Lydia Marsh was notified. She didn't cry in front of the officers. She asked if she could see the medal, then pressed it between her palms until her knuckles whitened. When they offered condolences, she said only, "He told me my boy was in a better place. I just didn't think he meant this one." Crowe stayed by the car as she walked back inside. He didn't take notes. Some details don't belong on paper. He drove away slowly, the church spire fading in the mirror. For the first time in years, Briar Creek felt heavier than its map, a place that had carried too much under its ground. The wind shifted. Leaves whispered against the windshield like low voices, impossible to make out, but impossible to ignore. That night, Crowe sat in his motel room, jazz humming faintly from a tinny speaker. The funeral invoices lay scattered across the bed, 5 years' worth. He marked each one signed by Ardane. 3 had identical coffin dimensions. He drew a line under them, wrote, "Pattern established, concealment method consistent, likely additional victims." He leaned back, rubbed his eyes. The music faded into static as the track ended. Outside, the night air was thick with rain. He opened the window a crack and listened. Somewhere beyond the hiss of water, a church bell tolled 9 times. He let it finish before he spoke aloud, almost to himself. The dead don't hide forever. They just wait for someone to listen.
End of Chapter 4.
Chapter 5. The Ledger of Mercy. The rain didn't stop for 3 days. It came down in sheets that blurred the headstones, soaked the tarps over the open graves, and washed the dirt tracks clean before the news vans could drive them into headlines. By Monday morning, the case was no longer quiet. Someone at the county morgue had spoken to a reporter, maybe a relative, maybe a conscience. The story broke under a mild headline that didn't fool anyone. Anomaly uncovered. Historic cemetery exhumation. The phone at the rectory rang until Whitcomb unplugged it. The diocesan lawyers arrived within an hour, briefcases gleaming like new sins. They asked him for statements, copies of correspondence, anything that could be framed as clerical misunderstanding. Whitcomb, pale and furious, told them he'd cooperate with police, not with their public relations office. When they left, Crowe was waiting on the front steps, coat dripping. "They'll try to control the narrative," he said. "That's what institutions do when the story turns real." Whitcomb nodded. "They called it unfortunate timing." Crowe almost smiled. "Truth always has terrible timing." In the basement, the plastic had been removed from the wall. The sealed room stood open now, brighter in the harsh forensic lights. Crowe walked its length with measured steps, letting his eyes adjust to the details he hadn't caught the first time. Faint scrapes in the paint at shoulder height, a single rusted nail half pulled from the stud, a smell of damp cloth and something older, maybe time, if time had a scent. He placed his gloved hand against the wall. The insulation was newer than the surrounding material, as if it had been replaced after each use. Cautious, methodical, practiced. In the corner, the drain sat half-sealed with resin. Crowe had the plug drilled under lab conditions. Inside the pipe, embedded in sediment, the technicians found fibers, tiny, colored, consistent with altar linens. A trace of blood protein matched the DNA from Daniel Marsh. Same boy, the lab tech confirmed later. He bled here before he was buried. Crowe didn't react. He just wrote the words "sequence confirmed" in his notebook and closed it. That afternoon, he visited the county records office to finish what the exhumation had started. The staff knew who he was by now, half deference, half avoidance. He spread Ardane's funeral ledgers across the counter, each page neat and looping, the handwriting of a man convinced that control equaled holiness. "Cross-reference coffin dimensions," he told the clerk. "Dimensions?" she asked. He pointed at the margin, where small numbers were noted in pencil, models, not scripture. Every coffin size ordered directly through the church. When the printout came, two more anomalies stood out. Parker, Ellen, 1989, no next of kin. Donovan, Peter, 2002, expedited burial. Both had casket models larger than the standard issue, ordered by Ardane personally. Crowe made copies, slid them into a file, and called McKenna. "We're not done."
McKenna met him that evening at the diner, the same one where the gossip had begun. The place smelled of rain and fryer grease. Whitcomb joined them halfway through, collar still damp, eyes sunken. Crowe laid the pages flat on the table. He didn't stop with one. There are at least two more graves with mismatched coffin records. McKenna frowned. "You think he kept them for years? Hid them that way?" "Not kept. Used the funerals as disposal. Each time, the deceased was someone without close family. Perfect cover." Whitcomb's voice was a rasp. "We can't exhume everyone. The bishop will—" "The bishop can pray over what's already been dug," Crowe said. "The rest will come through the evidence chain." McKenna leaned back. "We can't get a judge to approve 3 more exhumations without something stronger than model numbers." Crowe slid a photocopy across the table. Ardane's handwritten note from the Conway service. "Additional blessing performed. Private." McKenna read it twice. "That's your probable cause." Whitcomb rubbed his temples. "And your damnation," he muttered. Crowe's tone softened. "Father, damnation was built into this decades ago. We're just opening the door." 2 nights later, the rain stopped. The town looked scrubbed raw, its streets empty after dusk. Whitcomb's parishioners came to Mass in silence, left early, and avoided eye contact at confession. Crowe spent the evening in the rectory, study surrounded by boxes of parish records. He read them the way some men pray, slowly, with disbelief. Tucked between invoices for candles and hymnals, he found a stack of letters of condolence Ardane had written to families of lost boys. Each one was identical in tone, pastoral, vaguely sympathetic, careful to shift responsibility toward fate. Our Lord has chosen another path for your son. Take comfort in his mercy and in the knowledge that some souls are too restless for this world. Crowe stared at the handwriting until the words seemed to tilt on the page. He copied the phrasing into his notes. Mercy and silence. Repetition suggests ritual. At midnight, he drove out to the cemetery. The clouds had cleared, leaving the moon sharp and cold. He walked between the graves, flashlight off, memorizing the layout. Conway, Parker, Donovan. 3 graves in a perfect diagonal line, each 10 years apart. He crouched by the newest stone, brushed moss from the inscription. The ground beneath felt soft even now, the earth settling unevenly. He closed his eyes for a moment, hearing the faintest echo of a sermon he'd read earlier in the archives. Ardane preaching about the cleansing silence that leads to salvation. He whispered into the wind, almost to himself, "You buried them in order. Confession by geometry." The next morning, McKenna called. "Judge signed 2 more orders. They're authorizing 1 at a time, but we'll get there." Crowe packed his files, watching sunlight catch on the medal of St. Jude sitting on his desk. He had kept it not as evidence, but as reminder that even lost causes need someone who doesn't give up. He slipped the medal into his pocket and said, "Let's finish what he started hiding." By late afternoon, the teams were back at the cemetery. Cameras were banned this time, but the air carried the sense of being watched. The first coffin came up heavier than expected. Inside, beneath a neatly folded blanket at the foot, another small bundle waited. Bone, linen, and rosary beads. No one spoke. Crowe marked the coordinates, wrote Parker Grave, same method, same material, and closed his notebook. Whitcomb stood by the gate, eyes wet. He asked quietly, "How many?" Crowe's reply was simple. Enough to prove he didn't make mistakes.
That night, the town bell tolled for evening mass, but the pews were half empty. People said they were sick, or busy, or tired. Mostly, they were afraid of what remembering might cost. Whitcomb walked the aisle alone, the sound of his footsteps filling the space Ardane had once ruled through reverence and fear. He thought about closing the church altogether. Then he thought about the boys who'd never left it, and decided that leaving the doors open was the only kind of penance that mattered. Upstairs, in the rectory, Crowe wrote his final entry for the day. Pattern complete. Victims accounted for. Community complicit through silence. Case closed for evidence, open for memory. He turned off the light and sat a moment in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the boiler. The sound ran through the pipes like a heartbeat, steady, ghostly, still alive. End of Chapter 5.
Chapter 6. The Weight of Silence. The church felt different now. Too clean, too bright. Every echo sounded suspicious, as if the building itself were listening. Whitcomb moved through it like an intruder, switching off lights that had no reason to be on. He couldn't bring himself to go near the basement. Crowe, on the other hand, was spending too much time underground. He returned to the sealed chamber for one last sweep before it was released from evidence. The room was empty now, stripped bare, walls cut open, foam peeled away. Still, he crouched and ran his light across the corners. Dust settled unevenly on the concrete, except for a faint rectangle near the wall where the insulation had been replaced twice. A pattern of repair, almost ritual. He made a note, used more than once, maintained between incidents. McKenna joined him, boots echoing. Forensics says we can't date the residue exactly. Could be decades apart. Crowe nodded. That's the point. By the next morning, national press had arrived. The story had outgrown the county. Headlines used words like skeletons, scandal, and betrayal of faith. Whitcomb didn't read them, but parishioners did. Some called for closure, others for forgiveness. A few simply stopped showing up. The diocese sent a press release calling Ardain a complicated man who served with devotion. It didn't mention the boys. Crowe read it once, set it aside, and called the DA. We need to preserve every document before they vanish under a rebranding exercise. He spent the rest of the day cataloging Ardain's personal files, decades of sermons, expense notes, and marginalia. Most were banal, plumbing costs, choir rosters, but one notebook stood out. Inside were short entries dated irregularly, each with a name and a Latin phrase beside it. 1983, Daniel. 1989, Parker. 1995, Conway. 2002, Donovan. Then, beneath them, a final unfinished line. 2002, Confessio, Takeo. Whitcomb translated it out loud when Crowe showed him. Confession, I am silent. Crowe said he documented them as sins he didn't intend to repent.
They drove to the old funeral home that had handled Ardain's services. The owner, a weary man named Everett Nash, had inherited it from his father. He frowned when Crowe showed him the casket model numbers. "That's odd," Nash said. "Those dimensions weren't meant for our region. Custom imports. Expensive. Father Ardain requested them personally. Said he needed structural integrity for parish relics. My father thought he meant marble statuary." "Did he handle any of the funerals himself?" Nash hesitated. "He insisted on private blessings before each burial. We left him alone for a few minutes. Didn't think twice." McKenna wrote that down. Crowe didn't. He was staring at a row of order forms tacked to a board, each with Ardain's signature. A loop that closed too neatly, like a circle with nowhere for guilt to escape. That evening, Crowe sat outside the rectory smoking a rare cigarette, the kind he saved for cases that didn't end clean. Whitcomb joined him, collar undone. "I keep thinking I should pray for him," Whitcomb said. "For Ardain?" "For everyone," Whitcomb said. "For the people who didn't see." Crowe exhaled smoke toward the dark. "They saw. They just translated what they saw into something they could live with." "Is that judgment?" "It's survival," Crowe said. Whitcomb nodded, staring at the quiet houses across the street. "What happens when faith turns into fear?" Crowe didn't answer.
The bell tower struck 9, each note clear and hollow, echoing into the stillness that followed. The next morning brought a new problem. The local paper published an interview with Margaret Vale, the former secretary. Her guilt had curdled into confession. "I signed what he gave me," she had told the reporter. "He said the boys were better off away from sin, that they were going where they couldn't be tempted." The article named her directly, and by afternoon someone had spray-painted "complicit" on her front porch. When Crowe visited, she was shaking. "I thought if I helped him, it was mercy," she whispered. "He said he was saving them." "From what?" She looked at him blankly. "From the world." Crowe didn't reply. He knew the kind of men who built altars to their own justifications. He left her porch light burning and told the local patrol to keep an eye on her house. That night, he met McKenna again, same diner, different silence. "The DA wants to pause further exhumations," McKenna said. "Says it's enough for now." Crowe stirred his coffee. "There's still one grave untested. Donovan, 2002. "Let it rest," McKenna said quietly. "Public's drowning in outrage. Bishops lawyering up. The families—" Crowe cut him off. "They deserve to know where their children are." McKenna sighed. "You think you'll find peace in another coffin?" "No," Crowe said. "Just proof that peace never existed." He paid for the coffee, left the change, and stepped into the drizzle outside. As he crossed the street, the church bell began again, slow, hesitant, as if unsure whether to ring at all. Crowe stopped under its sound, looked up at the dark spire, and thought of the boys who'd sat in pews believing that voice was heaven calling. He whispered, "It was only ever echo." Then he turned back toward the rectory, the rain stitching faint silver lines across his coat. The town would keep its silence. That was what small towns did best. But Crowe had already seen what hid under silence, and he wasn't done digging yet. End of Chapter 6.
Chapter 7. The Last Grave. The next morning broke clear and cold, the kind of sky that made things look sharper than they were. Crowe didn't sleep much. He had spent the night sorting through photos, invoices, and that last unanswered entry in Ardane's notebook, 2002, Confessio Taceo. There was one burial left from that year. Peter Donovan. The file said expedited funeral, family request. No family had ever been located. He called McKenna at dawn. "We're not finished." "The DA said no more exhumations," McKenna replied. "The DA can argue jurisdiction. I'm arguing pattern," Crowe said. 3 graves, same dimensions, same priest. The 4th closes the loop. There was a pause, then a sigh. "I'll make a call, but this time you stay outside the tape." By afternoon, the crew gathered again in the cemetery. The town's patience was running thin. A small crowd stood behind the fence, pretending not to stare. Whitcomb was there too. Coat buttoned tight against the wind, he refused to hide behind the chancery walls. The coffin came up heavier than expected, same as the others. Crowe watched from a few paces back, notebook ready, jaw tight. The coroner pried open the lid. Inside was the expected, an elderly man, meticulously preserved, hands crossed over his chest. At his feet, a depression in the lining, nothing visible. The techs began removing the base fabric, slow and careful. Then one of them froze. A rosary bead rolled out, not the polished kind from funeral kits, but hand-carved wood, small enough for a child's grip.
More beads followed, tangled in remnants of fabric. Beneath them, tiny bones, brittle and clean. The tech whispered, "We've got another one." Whitcomb turned away, whispering a prayer, too soft to hear. Crowe didn't move. He only noted the details, the linen, the size, and the method. Exactly the same. The coroner met his eyes. "Mr. Crowe, same signature." "I know," Crowe said. He kept his pattern to the end. The remains were logged and sent to the state lab. Crowe and McKenna stayed behind, watching the coffin being resealed. The sun had dropped low, slicing through the maple branches. "Why keep burying them here?" McKenna asked. "Why not somewhere far away?" "Control," Crowe said. He wanted to keep them close, hide them under his own sermons. "You think anyone helped him?" "Someone always helps, usually by not asking questions." That evening, they met Whitcomb in the rectory kitchen. The priest sat with his hands around a mug gone cold. His voice was hoarse. "The bishop wants the church closed," he said. "For restoration, they claim. I think they want to bury the place before anyone else looks under it." "You'll fight it?" Crowe asked. Whitcomb's laugh was soft, bitter. "Fight? I've spent months defending a faith that didn't defend its children. I'll stay until it's clean, or until they take the keys." Crowe nodded, respecting the exhaustion in the man's honesty. "Then I'll stay until we finish the report."
2 days later, DNA confirmed what they already knew. The fourth set of remains matched a missing boy from 2002, last seen helping Ardane carry supplies to the church basement. No relatives, no next of kin. Just a file photo from a school ID and a case number that had been closed 20 years too early. McKenna brought the news to Crowe at the motel. "It's official. 4 victims. State's preparing charges against the diocese for obstruction." "Posthumous justice," Crowe said, closing his notebook. "The cleanest kind. No one to prosecute, everyone to blame." McKenna didn't argue. "You'll file your final report?" "Tomorrow." He gathered his papers into the worn leather case he'd carried for years. Outside, rain started again, soft this time, as if the sky had run out of anger. Before leaving town, Crowe stopped by the cemetery one last time. The 4 graves sat in their crooked line, new soil marking where the past had finally surfaced. Whitcomb stood nearby, hands folded. "Do you think people will forgive him?" "They'll try," Crowe said. "Forgiveness is easier than facing how much they ignored." Whitcomb nodded slowly. "You don't believe in mercy, do you?" "I believe in consequence. Mercy's what happens when you forget." He started to walk away, then paused. "You'll keep the church open?" "For now. Maybe until someone learns to pray without lying." Crowe half smiled. That might take a while. That night, he drove out of Briars Creek with the windows cracked, letting the cold air fill the car. The radio was off. The sound of the tires on wet pavement was steady and low, like breath in the dark. He didn't look back at the town or at the church tower fading in the rearview mirror. He had learned long ago that some stories don't end, they just stop being denied. In his notebook, he wrote a single line before closing it for good. Silence buried 4 boys, but noise was finally found them. He let the page dry in the wind from the open window and kept driving.
End of chapter 7.
Chapter 8. The Confession Files. The story should have ended with the last grave, but in Briar Creek, endings were a luxury. 3 days after Crowe left, McKenna called. "You'll want to see this yourself," he said. Crowe turned the car around before McKenna explained what this was. The diocesan office smelled like varnish and old incense. Reporters weren't allowed past the lobby, but McKenna had secured access. On a long oak table lay 4 boxes of Ardane's private papers, rescued not by the church, but by a custodian who refused to burn them. "They called it a spiritual archive," he said. "You'd better read before the lawyers do." Crowe opened the first box. Inside were confessional logs, written in shorthand. Each page bore initials, dates, and terse notes: weakness, temptation, absolution given. He flipped further until he reached the later years. The handwriting shifted, tighter, erratic, less priest than chronicler. Then came the final book. Unlike the others, its cover was plain black, no label. Inside, each page held a name. 4 names, and beneath each, a paragraph of Latin. Whitcomb arrived mid-afternoon, pale and sleepless. He translated the first 2 pages, he said. He wasn't confessing sins, he was recording his justification. Crowe scanned the text. Each entry was written as if to God directly, a twisted litany of pride disguised as penance. "They were the lambs who strayed. I kept them from the wolves by caging them in my care. Mercy through silence, redemption through obedience." Whitcomb's voice trembled. He convinced himself he was saving them. Crowe closed the book. No, he convinced himself he was God. They spent hours cataloging the files, receipts for the caskets, anonymous donations redirected to community outreach, lists of boys who had passed through church programs, most still alive, a few marked with quiet crosses beside their names. "Look here," McKenna said, pointing to a margin note. He numbered them. 4 we know, but there's a 5th initial, J.H. Crowe felt a chill tighten the back of his neck. No record of that name in any missing person report? Nothing that matches the time frame. Then he started, but didn't finish. Maybe interrupted. Maybe frightened himself. Whitcomb swallowed hard. "You think there's another grave?" "I think he ran out of years."
That night, the 3 men sat in Whitcomb's office while rain needled the windows. The black book lay on the desk between them, like a wound that refused to close. McKenna spoke first. "We hand this to the DA, right?" Crowe didn't answer immediately. He turned a page, reading the last entry. Confessio taccio. Confession, I am silent. It's not evidence, it's pathology. The courts can use the ledgers. This, he tapped the book, belongs to history, not trial. Whitcomb's voice was low. "You mean to memory?" Crowe nodded. "Same thing, if people keep it alive." By morning, the leaks had started again. Someone in the diocese whispered that a misinterpretation of the late Father Ardane's writings was being exploited by outsiders. The word outsiders was aimed directly at Crowe. He ignored it. He'd been called worse by better institutions. Instead, he focused on tracing the financial threads.
The funds Ardain had used for youth outreach were pulled from a diocesan discretionary account that hadn't closed even after his death. The same account was now paying the church's legal defense. Crowe wrote one line in his report: "Mercy Fund repurposed for silence. The circle remains unbroken."
That evening, Whitcomb found him in the church, sitting in the front pew. No lights, no ceremony, just the sound of dripping from the roof and the faint hum of the boiler, steady as a remembered heartbeat. "You're leaving tomorrow?" Whitcomb asked. "I've finished what I can prove," Crowe said. "And what you can't?" Crowe looked up at the crucifix, where shadow blurred the edges of the face. "That stays here. You'll have to live with it." Whitcomb managed a thin smile. "I already do." Before dawn, Crowe filed his final report with the state. He left copies of the ledgers, the casket records, and a translation of the Black Book. He kept only one page for himself, the list of names. On the back he wrote, "Truth isn't light, it's weight, and someone has to carry it." He folded the paper, slipped it into his coat, and walked out into the gray morning. Outside, the bell tower struck 6. Whitcomb watched from the steps as Crowe crossed the lot toward his car. The investigator paused once, glanced back at the church, and nodded, a gesture halfway between farewell and warning. When he drove off, the sound of tires on wet gravel faded like a held breath finally released. Whitcomb stood alone until the echo of the last bell died. Then he turned, locked the doors, and whispered into the empty nave, "Let the truth stay louder than him."
Later that day, the DA announced the investigation's conclusion. 4 confirmed victims, institutional negligence under review. For Briars Creek, that was enough. For Crowe, it was the beginning of another silence waiting to break. He didn't listen to the press conference. He'd already started a new case file, one with the same name written twice. Because in the kind of work he did, endings never really held. They only paused long enough for the next voice to be heard. End of Chapter 8.
Chapter 9. The Reckoning. It began quietly, as reckonings often do. A letter in the local paper. A town meeting. Then the headlines multiplied again, each version of the story louder than the last. For Briars Creek, faith had been a comfort. Now it was an argument. Half the town demanded the church be shuttered. The other half begged to keep its doors open as proof that faith survived sin. Somewhere in the middle stood Father Whitcomb, thinner and older than when Crowe met him. Crowe hadn't planned to return, but McKenna called again. He said, "You should see what they found in the rectory attic." Crowe was back on the road before sunrise. The box waited on Whitcomb's desk, dust still clinging to its corners. Inside were tapes, old cassettes labeled Confession, 1983 to 2002. Most were ordinary parish records, but one was marked only with a single word: penance. McKenna looked uneasy. "You sure you want to hear it?" Crowe didn't answer. He slid the tape into a borrowed player. A hiss of static filled the room, then a man's voice, Ardain's, soft, deliberate, rehearsed. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I've been granted a burden too heavy for those above me. I cleanse them so they may not fall again. The silence is my cross to bear."
A pause. Breathing. The scrape of a chair. Then the same voice again, lower now, less priest than predator. And the world keeps thanking me. The tape clicked to an end. Whitcomb's hand trembled as he reached for the player. Why would he record this? Crowe said, to listen to himself. Men like him don't confess. They perform. That night, the town held a vigil outside the church. Candles flickered along the iron fence, hundreds of small lights for boys whose names had only recently been remembered. Whitcomb read from the pulpit, hoarse, "We cannot pray for peace without first naming what we destroyed." Crowe stood at the back, coat collar turned up, unnoticed among the mourners. When the crowd sang Ave Maria, he stepped outside, where the hymn blurred against the wind. McKenna joined him. They're reopening old cases across the state. Your report did that. Crowe shrugged. Good, but it won't fix this place. Still, it's something, McKenna said. Something doesn't bury the dead right, Crowe replied. The next day, he met Whitcomb one last time in the cemetery. The grass was still raw where the graves had been opened. Whitcomb carried a small box of keepsakes, fragments of linen, rosaries, and the St. Jude medal Lydia Marsh had refused to take back. She asked me to leave it here. Said she wanted him to have what she couldn't give. He knelt, pressed the medal into the soil, and whispered a prayer Crowe didn't catch. When he rose, Crowe asked, "You staying?" Whitcomb's gaze drifted toward the church spire. For now, someone has to keep it from turning into a monument to the man instead of the truth. History always tries, Crowe said.
The diocese held a press conference the following week. A polished spokesperson stood at the podium, speaking of healing, review committees, and the restoration of trust. Not one question was allowed. Crowe watched from the sidelines, hands in his coat pockets. He'd seen the same speeches in other towns, other ruins dressed up as repentance. When the cameras cut, he walked away. That night, in his motel room, he replayed the tape again. The breath, the self-assured tone, the word silence. It wasn't penance, it was pride. He turned off the player, poured a coffee that had gone cold, and wrote in his notebook. He built a confessional that never needed forgiveness, only listeners too polite to interrupt. At dawn, Crowe drove out to the edge of town. A river curved through the valley, dark and slow. Mist rose off the surface, blurring the line between water and air. He pulled over, stepped out, and breathed. From the bridge, he could see the cemetery's spire, just visible through the fog. Somewhere under that soil were 4 boys who had never left town, even when everyone else did. He took the paper from his pocket, the list of names, and folded it into the river current. It floated a few feet, then sank, vanishing without ceremony. McKenna's voice echoed in his memory. "You ever get used to this?" Crowe's answer hadn't changed. "No, you just learn where to stand." When he returned to the car, his phone buzzed. A new message, another case, another forgotten file reopened by his report. He started the engine, the low hum filling the silence. Before pulling onto the road, he looked once more towards Briars Creek. The morning sun caught the church windows, flashing brief gold before fading into ordinary light. "You can't bury the truth forever," he murmured. "You just have to keep digging." He shifted into gear, and the town disappeared behind him. End of Chapter 9.
Chapter 10. The Room Below. By the time Bennett Crowe filed his final report, the town had gone still again. Winter was edging in, sharp enough to make breath visible. Snow gathered in the corners of the churchyard, covering the churned soil where the graves had been disturbed. It looked peaceful, if you didn't know what lay beneath. Inside the rectory, Whitcomb packed boxes. The diocese had reassigned him for his well-being. He didn't argue. Before leaving, he locked the basement door for the last time, though both men knew it didn't matter. Crowe stood with him in the nave. "You'll be all right?" "I'll find another parish," Whitcomb said. "Smaller, quieter, maybe one that still believes in redemption." Crowe nodded. "If you find it, let me know." Whitcomb's smile barely formed. "And you? You'll keep doing this?" "Someone has to," Crowe said. They shook hands, an honest, tired gesture, and the priest left with his suitcase. The church emptied fast after that. Stained glass light moved over bare pews, the air cold enough to echo footsteps. Crowe stayed until dusk, reading through his notes one last time. He'd condensed the entire investigation into 12 pages. Forensic findings, exhumation results, financial misappropriation, institutional obstruction. Each word was deliberate, emotion stripped away. The truth didn't need embellishment, it just needed permanence. When he finished, he added a final line at the bottom of the report. Victims, 4 confirmed, 1 unaccounted for. Probability of additional remains, low but not excluded. He hesitated, then underlined, not excluded. Before leaving town, he went back to the basement. The plastic tape was gone now. Only the outline of the doorway remained. The room was hollow. No scent, no sound. Just that peculiar heaviness of places that once held screams. He switched on his flashlight. The beam cut across the concrete, showing small grooves in the floor where furniture had been dragged or where knees had pressed. On the far wall, faint letters carved into plaster. Et tacebamus omnes. Crowe spoke the words out loud, his voice low. And we will all be silent. He closed his notebook. Not this time. He pulled a small audio recorder from his coat pocket, the kind journalists used. He pressed the button, let the silence fill it, then said, "This is Bennett Crowe, closing filed 2024-14. The room is empty. But silence isn't the same as peace." He placed the recorder on the floor and left it running. Outside, snow had started to fall harder. McKenna was waiting by the car, collar turned up. "You sure you're done?" "For now," Crowe said. "The rest belongs to history." McKenna nodded. "I'll see it through." "See that they remember," Crowe said, and got into the car.
He drove out of Briars Creek, slowly, headlights cutting through the storm. The town was a blur of dim houses and fading Christmas lights. In the distance, the church bell rang once, muffled by snow. He turned on the radio to fill the quiet. A jazz station crackled through static, low trumpet, brushed drums. It reminded him of the nights he'd stayed awake reading case files, waiting for dawn to arrive. He thought of Lydia Marsh, of Whitcomb's praying over the disturbed soil, and of the St. Jude Middle buried where the truth had finally surfaced. And then he thought of Ardane, not the man, but the machinery of him, discipline mistaken for faith,
power dressed as mercy, sin disguised as salvation. Somewhere in that tangle, a small voice had once called for help. No one heard it, not until now. At the edge of town, Crowe pulled over by the bridge. The river below was half frozen, moving slow under the ice. He rolled down the window, letting the cold air in, and whispered, "For the ones who never left the room." Then he tossed his empty coffee cup into the trash, shifted into gear, and drove toward the highway lights. Behind him, Briars Creek disappeared into snow and distance. The recorder in the basement kept running until the batteries died. 2 hours of soft hum and silence, the faint vibration of the boiler, and the echo of a bell marking another hour no one would remember. Crowe's report would end up in an archive file marked Closed Investigation. But in his personal ledger, under notes, he wrote one final line: "Evil hides best in devotion, and sometimes the smallest sound, a breath, a rumor, a name remembered, is enough to break the walls apart." He closed the book, turned the page, and began another case. End of chapter 10.
Thanks for listening. If you want more, subscribe and come back soon.